Welcome to If the Public Only Knew, the show that pulls back the curtain on what it really takes to build and lead a business. Host Gary Cinderbrandt sits down with some of today's most dynamic CEOs, founders, and leaders to dig into their origin stories, hard-earned lessons, and the missteps that nearly derailed it all. These are unfiltered, no-hype conversations designed to inspire, challenge, and fuel your own journey. Now here's your host, Gary Cinderbrandt.
Welcome back to If the Public Only Knew. My guest today is Jon Rosemberg. I was looking at his name on my calendar and I kept thinking Rosenberg. That's not it. There's an M in there, which maybe, Jon, you can mention how it got there. Jon, like a lot of our guests, is on a journey. And part of that journey, where we're going to talk about today, but it had to begin somewhere else. Coming out of Cornell University with an MBA, going into the corporate world, spending quite some time there and learning about things that he wanted to do and maybe things he didn't want to do. Through that process, he went back to school and got a further degree in applied psychology, which, Jon, I'm not sure if that confused the issues or brought clarity to a lot of the issues that we were dealing with.
Both.
But it's a pleasure to welcome you to the show today. Thank you for joining.
It did both. Nothing like studying psychology to really get really meta about your life. Thank you for the invitation, Gary. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's my pleasure. Let me start by congratulating you on the release of your book, which came out this past November. We're not necessarily here to pitch Jon's book, although I'm going to take a look at it, because it really goes into a lot of areas that I've always been focused on. And, you know, we talk about uncertainty leading to possibility. I think about the power of possibility, entertaining what is possible, not just probable or preordained. I think that's where a lot of people go wrong. So, Jon, why don't we start there? You come out of Cornell and you put yourself into a world where, yeah, sure, anything's possible, but you got a lot of walls around you. You've got a lot of hoops to jump through. You've got a lot of people who may not share your passion for personal or professional growth around you. Did you have an idea at that time that this would be kind of a limiting pathway if you stayed in the corporate world? You've come out of a great Ivy League school, you've got all the creds you need, and off you go, 9 to 5, W-2 job, a boss. What's the mindset at that?
Yeah. So, Gary, when I was in the corporate world and I spent over 2 decades there, I was chasing success. And I define success as an extrinsically motivated or an extrinsic motivator for life. And I would say the 3 big parts of success are money, power, and status. And that was my sole focus. And I said, if I can just be successful, then I'll have a good life and I'll be happy. And it took me longer than I'd like to admit to realize that although those things are important, and they're still really important to me, they weren't the full story. And this is when I started exploring the idea of thriving. I went back to school and got the master's in psychology, and I got really, really curious about what is thriving. And the way I define thriving is as agency, meaning, and connection. And we can talk a little bit more about the concepts and kind of break them down. But before we get into it, I just want to share a little bit about my story, because what got me to this point. So after 2 decades in the corporate world, I finally got an offer to join a startup here in Toronto, a logistics startup, fast, rapidly growing startup, double digits every month. I joined as chief operating officer with one of my goals as I joined was to do a Series B raise. And when we started the raise, we were looking to raise between 20 and 25 million. We ended up raising 115, and we created a much more aggressive plan for expansion. And, you know, as soon as I got that job, I said, I finally got what I wanted. I have the title. I have a huge team. I'm in this company that's growing really quickly. I have a lot of autonomy in terms of how I operate the business. And I ended up flying to Los Angeles because we were buying a couple of warehouses to continue expanding the business. And when I flew back from Los Angeles, I came down with COVID. This is right in the middle of COVID. And I was on a call, one of those technical calls with a technical team. And the call got really heated up really, really quickly. And at one moment, I was just so overwhelmed. I just shut down my computer. I closed the lid in my computer. I turned off my phone and I walked out of my home office and I heard my two kids, who are now 13 and my youngest one will be 10 tomorrow, actually. But at the time, they were 9 and 6. And I heard them playing in the basement. So I went downstairs to the basement and they were playing Legos. And I sat on the floor with them and I started playing Legos with them. And what I realized, Gary, was that I had not been present with my children. I was physically present. They would see me at breakfast or at dinner. I would say, have a great day before they went to school or whatever that looked like. But I wasn't actually present. I wasn't actually engaging or connecting with them in a meaningful way. And I said, what am I doing with my life? So in that moment, that evening, I was sitting in my favorite chair and Adriana, my wife, walks in and she says, hey, Jon, are you okay? And I said, I think I'm done. So over the next 2 weeks, I untangled myself from the organization. I send them clients and they're doing great and I'm rooting for them. They're a great company. And I decided to start my own consulting firm and ended up going back to school and doing all of the things that we talked about. So it was that. And by the way, this is a great story because it sounds like an epiphany. Like I had this moment of clarity where, I just got this moment of enlightenment. But this was a process that took years to get me to that point. And as a result of that, I said, I want to learn more about what makes life worth living, this idea of thriving. So that's how I ended up here talking to you today, Gary.
Go back just a little bit, because making the move from the stability you had at Procter & Gamble, and I assume you were doing a great job and probably moving up the corporate ladder with an increase in salary and lifetime security and all that kind of stuff. Making the move from there to a startup, despite how great the numbers look, we both know what the numbers are on startups. Most of them aren't going to make it. That's a pretty big move as far as destabilizing what there up until that point was a pathway that, well, nothing's guaranteed, but it was at least definable. Now you go into a startup and you're dealing with a founder, and having had experience in that area, most founders are kind of crazy, and a lot of founders don't make good CEOs.
You have to be crazy to do that. Yes.
And a lot of them don't make great CEOs. Reference Steve Jobs getting fired from Apple. So I get that part. What were you looking for when you left P&G to go to the startup?
So P&G was at the beginning of my career. I left actually a Canadian company, a Canadian retailer where I was at. It was a really stable job, great company. I think I felt like I had reached some sort of plateau in the organization that I was at. And I knew that I wanted to do something different. And I was really, really looking for autonomy, which is a precursor to agency, which is this big topic in my book. What I was really looking for was the capacity to make intentional choices, to that capacity that we all have to make intentional choices, to be able to exercise it. And within highly structured corporate environments, that can sometimes be very constrained, right? There's processes or systems, and you're kind of, there's a lot of boundaries attached to those processes and systems. And I found that was becoming more and more difficult for me to tolerate.
So at that point, those thoughts, were they present quietly and then they grew over time? Or was there something that even happened before that where you realized giving up your own agency was not going to be the way to go? Was there some impact you had where you came to maybe an earlier awareness and a later realization? Because I'm trying to comport the two. How did it just pop up all of a sudden where you said, even before the issue with the Legos, where you said, I can do more and I have to, but I can't do it here?
Yeah, I think it was a felt sense. I don't think there was a lot of awareness around it, Gary. Now there is. I think if you would have said the word agency to me 5 years ago, I would have thought of an advertising agency probably, or something of the sort. There was this unsettled state in which I was operating. And in the book, I described that as survival mode. And it's this state of kind of heightened awareness that can be highly adaptive. Survival mode. Gary, I do a lot of coaching work with senior leaders. So I'm often the one asking the questions, and I'm wondering if I can ask you a question as we're having this conversation.
Please
so
do.
Have you ever felt like you're in a state of survival mode?
Yes.
Okay. What
Definitely.
does that feel like?
It's very limiting. It takes everything and shuts it down.
Mm-hmm.
So in the back of my lizard brain, I guess in my amygdala, it just sends a message to the rest of my functional brain of you can't think, you can't act, you can't do anything. You're just screwed. So why don't you just give up? And then what gets me out of it is a little bit of time, a little bit of perspective, and something I've said to myself and my kids. Japanese or Chinese proverb, knock down 7 times, get up 8. All that matters is what you do next. And there's nothing that's preordained about what's going to happen to anybody except the decisions we make on a daily basis. As the famous philosopher Gandalf once said, we're all given a certain amount of time. All that matters is what you do with the time you have left.
That's beautiful.
I've referenced books and movies a lot. So yes, your answer.
I love that. And it's an incredibly agentic perspective. Now, I would say survival mode can be really helpful and really useful, right? I grew up in Caracas, Venezuela, which is in the news a lot these days after what happened recently. And when I was growing up, the year that I left Venezuela, by some estimates, there were 52,000 violent murders in the country. So it was a very dangerous place to grow up in. And survival mode saved me many times because this kind of lizard brain, however you want to call it, fight or flight response, this nervous system activation state was really helpful in terms of pointing me to where there was danger. And in the corporate world, it can also be very useful because it allows us to hyper focus all of our energy and all of our efforts on solving a problem. You hear this a lot from people who say, oh, I'm a problem solver or I'm a fixer, right? And that has a lot to do with some people are actually engaging their prefrontal cortex, but many of us, when we're problem solving, what we're doing is just blunt forcing it through this state of nervous system activation, right? Cortisol, adrenaline, all of it. And I was in that state for a very, very, very long time. And I would say you can have kind of like acute survival mode, which is kind of like a little spike, which can be really useful if you're, in a car accident or whatnot. But then you can have chronic, which is what eventually leads to burnout. And now we're seeing a burnout epidemic. And one of the things that I noticed as I was working in the corporate world is that survival mode can be very well rewarded in certain environments. Why? Because you're alert and you're constantly on top of things, right? So it can be misguided or mislabeled as productivity sometimes. And so there was all of this complexity around how I was operating. And frankly, as I started getting older, my body couldn't take it anymore, right? Like this level of stress and this level of constant activation was costing me a lot.
Understandable. So I've always looked at stress as a regular part of life. There's nothing we can do. Distress is obviously much more harmful. I think people use them interchangeably. What's your opinion of the juxtaposition of intuition, a feeling you should be doing something else but undefined, and what you're actually doing, and the disconnect or stress or distress that can create? In other words, where does intuitive feeling come in to the equation?
Yeah, I think first it's really important to define what intuition is. What are we talking about when we talk about intuition, right? Because we can confuse, and we often do, fear with intuition and certain emotions with intuition. I think intuition, which is this abstract understanding of the world that can offer us information to make decisions, is only possible when we are in a state of calm, when we are in a state of nervous system regulation. So, and I think we often confuse those things. Now, I think intuition is a really powerful skill that can be developed, but it requires a lot of practice and it requires that nervous system regulation. So people who are thriving can often tap into their intuition a lot more than people who are in this state of survival mode.
I would agree. I would agree. I think it's derived from considering and reflecting on past experiences. You've got to go through that wisdom portal And as it accumulates, you just kind of get a feel for what's going to be right for you and what's going to be wrong. How do you resolve an issue that I seem to be able to get past it with people that I work with, both in my professional capacity as a coach to financial advisors, my former life when I trained a lot of FAs and worked with a lot of clients that I had to teach, and now I work part-time as a ski instructor. So I'm always dealing with mental limitations. How do you resolve in that period of calm in real time, where you know that mentally that person can overcome what they perceive to be this horrible objective, but they've got to navigate to a place in their own mind where they have that prior experience, they have that prior considered wisdom, and they can kind of feel their way through and know there's something on the other side when everything in their conscious mind is telling them, stop.
Yeah.
Is it different for everybody?
So one of the ways in which I structure the book, and it's not really a book, it's more of a guide, I would call it. There's a map in it with 9 elements. And at the center of the map are beliefs. So beliefs are very powerful things because they are, whether consciously or subconsciously, they are like these glasses that have different tints and different colors with which we look at the world. So think about, there's been a lot of research or studies done around the placebo effect and people who are giving a sugar pill and told they're a painkiller and their pain levels actually decrease. And there's it's been replicated many times and there's lots of research around this. So our beliefs are hidden architects of what we believe it's possible. Are hidden architects of our lives. So what I propose, and after doing a lot of research and trying to learn, hey, how do we go from survival mode to thriving? And finding that agency is the big mediator between those two, after doing a lot of research, there were 3 things that kept coming up, Gary: awareness, inquiry, and reframing. So I summarized them in an acronym, AIR, because it's easy to remember. And awareness is noticing what is actually happening in the present moment. So let's say you get a text message that you feel it's aggressive towards you. So awareness is taking a moment to notice how your jaw tenses or your shoulders, get much tenser, or your breath gets shallow, or there's a rush of heat to your face. Noticing the emotion, maybe there's anger there, maybe there's sadness, and starting to just get a little bit of distance from the situation and actually noticing what's happening in the present moment. Now, there's lots of research on mindfulness and on meditation that shows how powerful this awareness can be in terms of creating distance between what we're experiencing in our condition. And it allows us to tap into metacognition and all of these different elements. It allows us to actually analyze the situation from a much more agentic place. So from awareness, we move into inquiry. And inquiry is just non-judgmentally asking lots of open-ended questions. This is a lot like the coaching process. It's just trying to learn what is happening here. So what is this text message saying about me? What is it saying about the person who sent it to me? What is it saying? What is this emotion, this anger trying to tell me? It's telling me that there's something important happening here and all of those things. And eventually there's the reframe, and the reframe is saying, okay, this text message is not something that I would have wanted to receive, or I don't like the way in which this person communicates, but this too, well, but in the picture of my relationship with this person, it may not be very important. Maybe let me use a more concrete example from my Please. Life. So Gary, what I found out over the past few months is that writing a book and promoting a book are 2 very different things. Talking about the ideas is it's a much different experience than writing them and working with them. And one of the things that I did is go on a lot of podcasts like yours. And I think it was like my 3rd podcast that I was recording. We finished recording the podcast and the host press stop. And he says, Jon, I've done 436 of these before yours, and I've never done this before, but we need to re-record it because it didn't come through clearly. You can imagine in that moment, I felt shame. I was angry. I was sad. I got really hot. I was in my mind. The thoughts were, I don't want to do this again. I don't want to promote this book. I don't want to be going on this book. I just don't want to do this anymore. Right. And in that moment, just that awareness allowed me to say, okay, what's happening here for me? So I went into inquiry and I said, okay, I'm clearly trying to develop a skill that I don't yet have. And it's going to require some work for me to learn this skill. And as part of that work, I'm going to fail. And I'm going to fail sometimes miserably, as I just did. And, then came the reframe. And I said, at least the host is being honest with me. This person is giving me feedback. And not only that, but they're offering me an opportunity to re-record the podcast. And I said, so from now on, the reframe for me, instead of saying I have to be perfect every time I show up at a podcast, the reframe was, I'm going to take each of these experiences as practice. Now, you'll ask me, practice for what? I have no idea. I still haven't figured that out. But that reframe, just saying this conversation, Gary, between you and me is just two humans having a conversation, and I'm just practicing sharing my ideas and the ideas in the book with the world. It lifted a weight off my shoulders. And it allowed me to engage in conversations in a very different way.
I really do get what you're saying. In one of my prior lives, when I was traveling the country on a regular basis, I would have a 6-hour presentation, usually 2 or 3 times a week, 2 weeks out of the month. And it was not written down. I had some PowerPoint slides that I worked with, but I found that almost every presentation, I was reframing certain parts of it because at the prior presentation, I figured out a better way to express it. So I might make a note on a slide or change the order of the presentation. I never worked with notes. I knew exactly what I was going to say right after I said it. Someone would ask me to repeat what you just said, and I would say, anybody remember that? Because I'm on. I don't. But I get that part about reframing because to me, it seems like it should be perpetual, especially if you're in a teaching or a coaching position. If you're not dedicated to the acquisition of knowledge as a student, what right do you have to teach anybody else?
It's beautiful.
When you use that air thing, I really thought about that. I still do it. I massage it. I move it around. I mean, literally, I'll be mic'd up and there's a bunch of people in the audience waiting for me to start. And I'll still be putting that last touch on a slide and reframing the message in a certain way because the prior time I did it, I don't think it quite resonated in the way I wanted it to. But I had to have the feedback, like you did, to be able to get it. Fortunately, no one ever asked me to go repeat the 6 hours. I just did word for word. I don't know that I'd be up for that, but I understand where you're coming from. Good for you. Fascinating.
And it's interesting because it's that beginner's mindset that can be a really powerful way to learn. And in order to be able to get to that point, Gary, I think we need to be out of survival mode. Because if we feel like our life is at stake, and that often happens, more than once I received a Sunday night email from my boss saying, we need to meet tomorrow morning at first thing in the morning. And I immediately went into a panic attack, right? To the point where, it must have been 8 years ago, I had an argument with my boss, and the panic that I felt was so profound that I ended up not only going to group therapy, but taking SSRIs for a period of about 18 months. And it was really difficult for me. So our mental health can be really impacted by our environment. So I think in order for us to be able to comment something and be able to practice air, we need to find ways to get out of survival mode. And in order to get out of survival mode, we have to practice air. So there's a bit of bi-directional kind of situation happening here.
Jon, when you're speaking to upper level or C-suite executives or you're giving a talk, we all look, if we've got the podium, we're all looking for that aha moment where the eyes open a little bit. People may jot something down or they're nodding unconsciously or things like that. Do you find those moments to be consistent based on the recipient or the audience? Or do you find that different people are going to latch on to this chain of information or messaging at different parts? In other words, is everyone perceiving the same thing at the same time? Or do you find that you have to kind of span somewhat of a spectrum to meet each individual where they might be?
I would say the latter. I think we're all different, It's interesting because as part of, this book tour that I'm doing, I get asked a lot of questions like, what are the 5 things that somebody needs to do in order to thrive? I'm like, I have no idea. I'm writing a book about agency. The whole point is that you figure out what works for you. And I think when we're sharing knowledge or research or whatever we've learned or ideas or wisdom, however we want to call it, it's going to land differently for every person. Gary, for me, I think it was maybe 6 or 7 years ago, somebody said to me, "You're not your thoughts." And I had heard similar things before, but I didn't really understand what they meant. And I had an experience. I went on a work trip to Vancouver, and I had an experience. I was on a ferry, and suddenly this thing came up for me, and I said, "You're not your thoughts. You're not." What does that mean? And I was able to momentarily detach myself from my thoughts. And in that moment, I understood what it meant. But it took me a very long time from the inside into it actually becoming an insight for me. I'd say from the information, the moment I receive the information to turn into insight, there has to be a process. And I think that process is different for each of us.
I would agree. Yeah.
Part of what I'm trying to encourage in the book is that you find what is the right insight for you, and what is the right moment for that insight for you. And that you take ownership and you use your agency in order to figure out how it works for you best.
When you're working with C-suite executives, do you find their binding issues, their freeze points to be pretty common? Did they go through a progression where they were chasing up the corporate ladder, or maybe they came up from the founder pathway? Do you find the issues to be somewhat similar within that role?
I will say one of the most common threats that I find across the work is this core belief that has two sides to it. One side to it is I need to prove myself. And the other side, which is even more pervasive and painful, is I'm just not good enough. And I find that this belief tends to permeate our lives in a very significant way.
So we're discussing imposter syndrome?
Well, imposter syndrome is one of the ways in which we've defined it. And I would say imposter syndrome kind of falls within that. But I think more importantly than calling it a syndrome or pathologizing it, this is a belief that I think most of us carry from childhood or from whenever it was. And it's challenging when we don't see it, because no matter what we achieve, you finally got the promotion, right? And 2 weeks into the promotion, 2 weeks into the race, you're saying, well, what's next?
Yeah.
I think there's also a bit of there's a systemic force at play. Listen, Gary, by all the evidence that we have available to us, the neoliberal capitalist world that we live in, it's the best that we've had in the history of humanity. It's delivered to us, this computer, this Zoom room, all of these great things that we have. It's thanks to that mentality. Now, I think it's gone to a point where there's no walls around it. So we are burning out because we can have unlimited money. We're about to have the first trillionaire in the world, right? Like there's never been such an accumulation of wealth. And we're constantly comparing ourselves to the person beside us. So there's always more. There's always more money. There's always more power. There's always more status, another title, another thing. And so people say, why are we burning out? Well, because we always just want more. And it's driven by this idea that unless I get to this point, I won't be good enough. So what I'm suggesting here, and by the way, I'm not advocating for socialism, because being born and raised in Venezuela, I know firsthand how difficult it is to live in that. So, but what I'm advocating for is this idea of saying, what is enough? What is enough for us? What is enough? Is it the big house and the 5 houses, the 10 houses, the 12 houses? So, and I find that this belief tends to permeate our lives in a very pervasive way. And again, I'm not suggesting we change it. And listen, I feel it as much as the next person. What I'm suggesting is that if we just bring a little bit of awareness and curiosity to it, we can work with it to make the best out of our lives and the lives of those around us. If we just let it run our life blindly, it can be very, very difficult.
So my audience is pretty broad, I think. At least I think they are. I've got entrepreneurs, financial advisors, who knows? My podcast is, I think I'm up, I don't know how many episodes. I think I've got 40 or 50 in the can and a bunch more that are going to be posted. But I can see that the audience is growing. Who should contact you and how do they find you? Tell me what you're looking for in a client relationship.
For me, the only thing that matters is that the client shows up. If you make a commitment that you show up, that's it. That's all I'm looking for. In terms of how they can find me, my website is Jon Rosemberg with an M.com. And you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm fairly active on LinkedIn. And reach out if an idea or if anything of what we just talked about, Gary, resonated with you, please reach out and maybe to work together or maybe just to have a conversation. Maybe you disagree with something that I said, and I hope you make a really good case against what I'm advocating for. I think that's also part of the joy of learning.
Jon, thanks for joining me today. These conversations, especially from someone that conceived an idea and has brought it forth and can actually contribute value to society, which I've always attempted to do, sometimes better than others. But when I meet kind of a fellow journeyman along that same path, I think folks like you and I tend to maybe underestimate or maybe understate just how powerful your own thoughts can be and how you can change your own reality by starting with a singular decision and a single step and employing a lot of the metrics that I know you reference in your book, which I'm going to jump into very, very shortly. Thanks again for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Gary. What a great conversation. I really appreciate the opportunity.
It's my pleasure. Our guest has been Jon Rosemberg with an M. Check out his book, recently released. You can find him on jonrosenberg.com. Jon, be well, and thanks again.
Thanks for tuning in to If the Public Only Knew. Don't forget to follow the show and share it with anyone who's ready for the real raw stories behind the business successes. Join Gary next time for another powerful conversation that will leave you inspired and ready to take action.